or make any comments. Good.
From much of what you said, I found out that Talensi Divination is very much similar to other divinations around West African areas and even among some other groups. But what I would like to know clearly is the difference between a diviner and maybe a native doctor. Because it seems his work is interlocked or something.
What area do you have in mind?
Well, some areas in eastern Nigeria.
In eastern Nigeria, yes.
Right.
Well, it is very similar. The Talensi diviner is not a doctor. Doctoring is quite a different story. Doctoring is something that any individual member of the society has. In fact, everyone has some medicine or another. It has nothing at all to do with doctoring. It's a purely question of divination. Though he might give advice. But it's quite different from, say, the southern Bantu, where the diviner is a doctor also, knows roots and herbs, or some of your southeast Nigerian diviners. Or priests. Yes. It was a good question. Yes.
I'd like to know a bit more about the criteria for success in divination, which would be tied in with the question of what makes a skilled or a talented diviner or consulter. If the divination is given in very general terms, it seems, how is that, I mean, in a sense, in terms where the divination can't be wrong, or at least can't ultimately come out wrong.
Can never be wrong,
yes.
Ultimately, yes.
How then is a good diviner and a good consulter distinguished from anyone else?
Well, in a way, it's a purely empirical question. For instance, I could, I've got a lot of material on this from my earlier work, and it still applies. Now, let me just see if I can find, here's a case where a friend of mine who was a diviner, and I came to him one morning. Yes, I've got it here. I went round to Paozong one morning. He lived only about 15 yards away from me. And if on a morning and there was nothing special, I'd go there. And when I arrived there, there was a young man who came to divine and produced a small cup full of groundnuts and put it down there. And my friend, the diviner, said to me, don't take him seriously, he's only just learning to divine. He was a young man in his 20s, he wasn't married yet, you see. And partly the diviner was helping him to find the answers. This man was a reasonably close kinsman of the diviner, and he was learning the job by coming in to divine every now and then. And as a matter of fact, the diviner would get very annoyed and impatient and say, you're wasting my time. But as he was a kinsman, he couldn't very well chase him out. So they went through the motions of divining, and he was too young to have any real ritual responsibility. But he was learning. So you learn the job, you learn how to do it on the job, as it were. Make a point of it. Now, what are the criteria for being a good diviner? Well, it's a matter of practice. Some people get known as good diviners, and some get known as clumsy diviners. And it's a skill which you cultivate with time, you just go on. And the people themselves say, well, it's as I told you earlier. Some people are intelligent, learn the game, others are not. There's no training process. It's a matter of picking it up as you go along. And the most significant factor in the whole story, when you look into the histories of, say, 20 of these diviners, is that the most significant factor, which I, as an observer, identified, not they, was that somebody who grew up in the home of a diviner, whose father or grandfather was a diviner, became more skillful at the job. In fact, one of the games one played with, say, 7, 10-year-old boys was you played the divination with them. Some were good, because they were at home, they saw this happening all the time. Others were not. So that's the only explanation I can give you. It certainly isn't a matter of inspiration or of anything of that kind.
Now, clearly,
Yeah.
if you, I mean, the kind of sort of ease with which you manipulate the thing, I mean, given that you're dealing with a sort of technological system,
Yes.
I mean, if you fumble about with it, you know, you don't look very good, and you're not much good at the technology
That's right, yes,
in that
yeah,
way, and that
yes.
you learn in the house.
Yes.
Isn't there another element which is perhaps less easy to learn in that it deals with sort of interpersonal differences? I mean, your tape suggested that a guy, and certainly this is
Yeah.
true among the later guy, I mean, usually to be a successful divine, he has to be a very verbal character. I mean, he has to be able to manipulate words if he's going into this confrontation with a
Yeah.
client. So, I mean, isn't there an aspect there in which he has to have sort of particular sort of verbal skills?
Well, let me say that with regard to that, an average adult Talensi male has a great level of verbal skills. I've got tape recordings of just conversations with chaps who are not diviners. And when when I played them to Moses, he said, we've forgotten to speak Talensi like that. That's beautiful. These weren't diviners, they were ordinary citizens, ordinary people. But certainly, I think the diviner cultivates much more of this rather esoteric verbal skill.
Yes.
And the chap who can pick that up and work that
Yes.
is better at the job.
And who can pull out a sort of proverb at a particular right time, that kind of thing.
Well, they don't go in for proverbs so much. It's all proverbs is much more thing you get in a court case. But the implications are always in terms of this business. The other thing is, of course, it's another thing. When you talk to a diviner, a mature diviner, you find he is tremendously knowledgeable about the whole religious system. He's taken an interest in it. He's able to give you much more of a kind of analysis of the possibilities. Now, this may be a product of having practiced as a diviner, because I also had friends who had that knowledge, but when I talked about divination, I'm talking, for instance, Pauzong, who was helping this young man to learn the trick.
No.
His, practically next door to him lived another man, a friend of mine, who was very good at this, who knew the ritual system very well and knew all the possibilities and things like that. But who simply said categorically, no, I'm not going to divine, I know. They want this old woman, damn her, his great-great-grandmother, somebody, keeps on pestering me. She wants me to be a diviner. I've set up a shrine for her. I don't mind giving her a goat now and then or something like that, or a sheep. But I'm not going to divine because it's a waste of time. I want to be a farmer. There's much more to be gained that way. Am I going to sit in that hut and get a penny at a time for a whole morning's work when I can go out and attend to my farms? So this particular skill, although it also exists in non-diviners, but on the whole, you find the diviner is somebody who has either a natural interest in it, and certainly there is such a thing. There are people who are interested in knowing all about the ancestors and the stories of people and the rituals and circumstances. Who are the best consulter I knew was a man who was invaluable to me. He was notorious as the laziest man in the place, because he would never farm. And they used to say, well, oh, you want so-and-so? Well, you'll find him. He's sitting listening to a court case or attending some ceremony or ritual somewhere. And he was an absolutely marvelous consulter.
You prefer the work of the
Because
gods
he
to the work of men?
That's right, he preferred the work of the yes, yes. Go on, sorry.
I have a very general question
Yes.
based on the paper that you circulated beforehand.
Yes, yes.
But if you define ritual as being a way of settling uncertainty, of apprehending the occult,
Yes,
then it
it's
seems
true,
that
it's not quite the same thing. You can settle uncertainty by throwing a penny, you see.
okay, well, in some ways of settling sort of unconscious conflict or whatever, it seems that you might have a problem first in differentiating ritual from mythology.
From
And
mythology,
That's right.
yes.
And second, from explaining some of the specifically non-instrumental ritual, a great deal of the ritual that people just seem to engage in for arbitrary reasons, going to church on Sunday and things like that.
Well, I think this opens a very, very big subject, and I'm not sure that I'm competent to deal with it. But the way I saw ritual in both the Talensi and elsewhere where I've been and experienced it in my own life is this, that ritual is whatever form of action it takes, it always assumes that it's addressed to powers, authorities, persons, what you want to call them, that are not accessible in an ordinary face-to-face communication. Putting it crudely like that. This is the big difference. And that, therefore, as I see it, to give any sense to the word ritual, instead of using it for cricket or for a banquet, as is sometimes done, the ritual of cricket, the ritual of a banquet, see, the ritual of Parliament is talked about, instead of using it for any kind of organized ceremonial activity, you must either use it in a very specific, rigorous sense to say that it concerns, that ritual refers to action. I'm talking about action, not thought, and words are action too. Action which is directed towards making contact with, or transacting with, or mobilizing something that you might call supernatural powers. The other side of a curtain of some sort, which cannot be made contact with or mobilized or got into touch with except by ritual, because ordinary things don't do. Now, of course, there are a great many variations, I suppose, or there's that latitude. And why I chose for this particular paper to talk about divining was because it's very obviously a technique of getting in touch or making some sort of contact with what you might call the supernatural, or as I called it, the occult. And that's a word I simply took from the current. You'll find that word used by Malinowski, find it used by Evans Pritchard if you read articles, witchcraft, magic, and so on. So I can't, I'm not sure that I can help very much in elucidating what you're after, except to, in a way, reaffirm my own stance. People going to church, you see, you don't know where they're going until they tell you they're going to church. They're not going to shop. If you're simply concerned with the going, the business of walking, well, you'll have to look for all sorts of signs. They wear Sunday clothes. You must know you'll have to know the dress idiom to know that they're dressed in their Sunday best and not in their working clothes. It certainly is quite a distinctive pattern of action when people go to church. And it's a pattern of action which you can regard as being, in a way, I suppose, preliminary to what's going to happen in church, and therefore already has the ritual implication of being an action directed towards the recognition of God or of what you will. But from my point of view, or for my purpose, I think we need a strict term which recognizes this business of wanting to have transactions with, or relations with, or recognition of, or submission to, whatever you want to call them, powers and principalities, all these strange words exist, that are not accessible by the ordinary human means of directly arguing with them, talking with them, and so on. And it's good, perhaps I may just say that it's a personal kind of predilection for my own convenience.
Mr. Fortes, I was interested in your observation that after 30 years you could pick up from where you'd left off.
Yeah.
Especially as you also noted the change in fashion, the change in transport, and evidently many other changes in society. But if we consider the technique generalizable as it was, is there any evidence from your revisit that the technique was not succeeding as well as it used to?
Succeeding in what way?
People were
not
not
just as
accepting.
patronized. It was just as much, the diviners were just as patronized as they were before.
Were there individual instances where people who were consulting or people who were implicated in consultations would reject.
You mean
the results.
non-believers? We're on the belief business, is it?
Mm.
Now, I'm rather inclined to tell you a story about Evans Pritchard there, which perhaps would be the answer to it. Do you know the story, Jack?
I don't know it yet, no.
No,
I don't know what story you're going to tell.
it's a very true story because I'm sorry all the parties concerned are dead, but this happened in Oxford when he was Fellow of All Souls, when Friedman was sitting down to lunch with a man called Gertner, who was used to come up twice a week to teach rabbinics, the Oxford rabbinic student, and who was a very extremely learned man and also, you know, presumably an Orthodox Jew teaching rabbinics. Anyhow, Evans Pritchard came in and walked in and sat down with him, and after they'd been going a little while, Gertner said to Evans Pritchard, did he mind being asked a very personal question? And Evans Pritchard said in his usual way, no, I don't, ask me anything you like. Gertner then said, tell me, Professor Evans Pritchard, do you really believe everything your church teaches you? And Evans Pritchard thought for a minute and then said, well, this business of believing is a 19th century invention, you know. Now, my church doesn't ask you any questions about believing. All it wants from me is evidence of assenting. If you assent, that's good enough. And this is the model that I must present to you. Man consulting a diviner doesn't ask himself, nor is he ever asked, do you believe? He's asked, all he's expected to do is to show evidence of assenting to the system. And when I've talked to Christian Talensi, and I have many Christian friends and so on, you know, when they're a bit sophisticated and they've thought about it, they've said, we don't see any contradiction here at all. As far as we're concerned, the ancestors are still significant, and we have no better explanation of things that go wrong. Of course, some of them have left it, but that's a different problem altogether. So the answer is there's no evidence of non-believing, and the question doesn't arise, you don't ask in that sense. People act. The actions they perform, the decisions they make, the choices they make, show that they take it for granted that in their world of thinking, ancestors are there and are playing an active part.
Yes, there was a lovely illustration of this last Saturday. I'm sorry you couldn't be there at the 26th anniversary celebrations of Ghanaian independence, which took place in an appropriate priestly building of
we had a
Edmund's
visitor.
and consisted, of course, of prayers to God by various priestly figures, and pourings of libation to the earth, and innumerable reference to the ancestors who had made Ghana what it is today and will continue to make it. Yes.
Consultants actually subsequently use the authority of divinations in sort of in justifying the decisions they made afterwards.
You mean outside the consulting situation?
Yes, outside the consulting situation.
Consultants are simply regarded as vehicles. The consultant is consulting for himself, of course. He doesn't get authority that way, he gets authorization that way. That consultant was consulted for himself. Or, for instance, the man who was consulting for his son's mother-in-law. What he did was he went home and then, in fact, he didn't even go himself to tell the mother-in-law. He sent a young man, go and tell her the following. I don't know what it all means, but she'll know. You see. It was a very peculiar case. Usually it's men who are the transactors in all of these things, but she had been left a widow and had all sorts of troubles that come upon her. So the consulter is merely a vehicle, either for himself or for others. Doesn't give him any power, authority, or status outside what he normally has. And the same is true of the diviner. The diviner has been divining at great length for somebody who, on the occasion of a death or something of that sort. but it doesn't in any way equip him to exercise any power. It may acquaint him with things that he wouldn't otherwise know, but even that. It's very much, I always feel that the pattern is very exactly the same as in the case of a psychiatrist who learns an awful lot about individuals and forgets their names, doesn't even recognize them in the street. It's a tremendously, what shall I call it, honor-proof and foolproof system altogether. And of course you can never be wrong, because you can come to you consult over and over again, you come to the same diviner. For instance, this young man whom I'm telling about, when in the course of the divination, some things came up, and the diviner said to him, "Look here, last time you came to see me, only a few days ago, I told you about this. Why don't you take any action on it?" He said, "Well, I just wanted to confirm, to make sure that it was so."
I wanted to ask you, if there was no change in the divination process itself, was there any change in the type or the number of actual objects in the magic bag from the earlier divination?
There were, yes. There were all sorts of, for instance, as I said, one of the objects was the discarded cartridges for my machine. But for instance, I tell you one object which has come in. There have been objects have been added which reflect the kind of world of today. Now, one of the changes in the world of today is that literacy has entered. So things get written now. There is more, well, children go to school, they have books to read, letters get sent backwards and forwards to brothers or to offspring who are way down south. So literacy had entered in a certain way in 1963. And most diviner's bag will now contain something like some piece of paper which can be pointed to as referring to bone. It's called bone, the skin, but bone. It means there's some matter here concerning a paper. And it might be something like a distant relative who has been written to about problems going wrong at home and who has taken no action, or who should be written to. So you have things like that have happened. But that's a very logical extra. And then again you see, you might, for instance, when in the 30s, when the divining stick picked out a piece of iron, it could mean something like, it could mean a hoe or a spear or a knife. When you pick out a piece of iron now, it could easily be interpreted as a bicycle. The system lends itself to that kind of improvement and addition.
So there is some change, obviously, in the content.
Exactly, oh yes.
Of the system of signs and so on.
Yes.
And you were really talking about the actual process, the technical process
That's
of
right.
selecting amongst
Yes,
these.
yes.
But could I ask, I mean, I found that although there was a great, considerable stability in the actual
Yes.
techniques of that kind, that nevertheless people accepted other forms of divination. I mean, while I was there, someone came in with something very popular, who was actually using school books. And he was using his child's school book, and he was divining not with a stick, but with a pencil.
Yes,
And instead of objects, he had a series of marks on a piece of paper.
yes.
And this was an astounding.
This is an invention of his own, was it?
As far as I know, I
Yes.
don't know that he learned it from anywhere.
Yes, yes,
I mean,
yes.
it had a whole series of things which are like, the
The original.
But
Yes.
he became extremely popular
Yes.
as a diviner
Yes,
in the
yes, yes.
area, sort of supplementing the other techniques that were around.
Yes.
I wondered,
Well, I can give an
were there
example.
any supplements? Was there any sort
Yes.
of sand divination or anything like that?
Oh,
going
no,
on as
no,
well?
nothing of that kind was happening. But what was happening, for instance, is that not on the living in the small town near where the Talensi lived was a Talensi who'd become a Muslim and who divined by the Quran. He'd opened the Quran and he divined that way. He read, as a matter of fact, I still haven't been able to check his, I've got a tape recording of his purported Arabic that he's reading, and I must check and see whether he really was Arabic. It could have been something he memorized. But he'd open the Quran at random and read a bit of a surah, and then that would be, and he would divine from that. He would interpret it. But the most interesting thing was that his interpretations were always couched in the traditional idioms. That is to say, he would say, there are some good things coming to you. You're going to get very rich. You're going to get a new wife. When he divined for me, he promised me all these things, you see, and things like that. He also told me you'll live to be a very old man, but you must be very careful of Monday because you'll die on a Monday, so try to avoid Mondays. Now,
That's like we got the right there.
I don't know how you did that, but there he was. That kind of divination was coming in, and he was doing quite well. But the interesting thing was that he couldn't set up business right in the Talensi country. He was on the fringe, and various people came to him there and took him seriously. When they had divined with him, the people with any real sense would go and consult one of their own diviners.
Yes, but of course people consult several diviners anyhow, don't they?
Exactly, yes, yes.
Thomas?
No, I was just thinking of the Ifa verses, and you also get the stories about about the railway lines as an example for certain types of behavior and all that.
Yes, yes. Yeah. These are metaphors that are introduced or comparisons and so on. Yes, I gave you one or two examples, but one could pursue it a little further. The real point I was making was that, of course, the basic technique and the basic materia, whatever you want to call them, remained the same, and the induction into divining remained the same, and so on. And there were, of course, additions. For instance, in the 1930s, you could never get a Talensi to drink hard liquor. It was hopeless. If I tried to, even bottled beer, they wouldn't drink. Never touch it. But now, one of the things that in 1963, one of the first things that Nkrumah did was to legalize illicit gin distillation. Anyone could.
Well, I couldn't do it before because it was illegal. For the British government made it illegal to brew gin, didn't it?
No, well, it wasn't done in the town among the Talensi.
No.
Illegal gin was being brewed south. I mean, one of the most tremendous gestures of confidence given to me in Agogo was when I was allowed to see a still in the bush.
Yes.
But it's reached the north now, and no ceremony was complete. You still had beer as an important thing, but you couldn't complete any ceremony without some bottles of locally distilled illegal gin. And incidentally, the chief distillers of the illegal gin was the family of the senior Tendana. And when it happened by one of those strange freaks, I was in 63 and I visited them again in 70. When I was in 70, they told me that the still caught fire and burnt down, the thing had burnt down. They said, you see, they were asking for it. Earth priests, earth custodians, doing that kind of thing. It didn't take long. The earth caught up with them, burnt their thing down. So there were, what I'm simply stressing, I don't want to you saw the picture of all the people coming, the public at this funeral, the women dressed, the men dressed in different ways and still acting out the day dance, still putting on these traditional old-fashioned hunting caps, which they wouldn't use at all now in hunting, although in the 30s they did, hunting medicines. So there have been a great deal of changes. And of course, between 63 and now, and 20 years later, there should have been even more changes, I'm sure. But from the point of view of an investigator, from my point of view, it was a godsend that they were still practicing divination the way they did before. And sacrifices, too, exactly the same thing.
Do you feel that there's any sort of relationship between divination and gambling or gaming insofar?
I think so. Oh, yeah, oh yes, there's a great, there is a, in the sense that gambling, yes, I think there is. I mean, obviously the outcome isn't known in advance, except that I think with this kind of divination you're on surer ground than you are with gambling.
Among the later guy, of course, the technique is precisely the same. That is, I mean, it's like playing France in America. I mean, you're not throwing stones in the binary business. So
yes.
You're throwing carries,
throwing carries, yes.
Which are up or down.
Yes.
And that's precisely the same with gambling. I mean, you use the same. You can't tell. I mean, you could walk through at a funeral. You couldn't tell whether people were doing a certain phase in a divination or whether they were gambling.
Yes. Well, yes.
I mean, because both are randomizing processes.
That's
which,
right. Yes. It's in the universe, but it's you're randomizing within the universe. But you see, yes. But in a way, yes, it's as you call
well, I mean, you're randomizing. It's
of course.
There are things which you haven't got control over.
That's
I mean,
right,
as distinct from your southern businesses of inspirational stuff in which you're speaking. I mean, it is a demonstration that truth is there.
Yes.
Or that profit and loss of that. I mean, is that there's a certain pattern.
The chips fall in certain ways,
The chips fall in a certain way, which are independent anyhow of human manipulation, whatever we think up there is helping.
The interesting thing, may I just add here, that even when you have inspirational divination, like, I don't know about the classical shamans, but where I've seen it in Zululand and in southern Ghana and elsewhere, there comes a point when it is accepted that some kind of objective test must take place. For instance, when you go to a temple in southern Ghana and the priest divines and speaks and utters these prophecies or whatever you will, at some point or another, one way of testing it is by taking the priest or the so long since I've seen it I can't remember, but one of the parties anyhow takes an egg and throws it with a crack onto a great block of wood which is part of the paraphernalia. The egg breaks. If the egg falls with convex sides, its possibilities are two convex, two concave, one or the other. And if it's a propitious outcome, if it's really right, it's got to, again, it's a spinster, it's got to be one of each. If it's the two convex sides up, that's very bad. You've got to start all over again. So, and another test they use is something very much like the Benga test. Yes. You bring a little chicken and put it down on some space where there's a lot of accumulated egg yolk or things like that. Generally, it's a little chick, only 3 days, 2 days old or so. If the chick immediately pecks, that's a propitious sign that it's all right. If it doesn't peck at all, then you've got to start all over again. So sooner and the same was true in Zululand when I went there with Harriet. At some point in the whole process, some kind of objective test like is introduced to convince the parties that they've been getting the stuff as it really is. But there is this difference. Sorry, I'm
But what's then the reaction if the sacrifices are made to the ancestor concerned? Yes. But if the misfortune is not going away, what are the reactions?
Well, you go to a diviner, another diviner, and the other diviner finds out, tells you, or you learn from him, that you see you made the sacrifice to your great-grandmother, but you should have realized that even a great-grandmother doesn't arrive on the scene by herself. She had a mother. And she's angry now. She's saying, why did you ignore me and give it to my daughter? Another chicken to her. So you can go on like that, because the ancestors, there's an infinite range of them. And you can never be sure that you've got the right one. If things go right, well, you probably have the right one until the next trouble arises.
Well, the next trouble, you will surely go back to the diviner who was the last successful one, wouldn't you? I mean, there would be a notion of success there.
No, you don't necessarily go back to the same diviner. You may go to your favorite diviner because you don't hold him responsible for the thing.
There are different forms of divination. For example, the one of death that you were showing us here.
Yes, yes.
I mean, as you were saying, I mean, that's a regular thing that happens every time. There's a death, anyhow, of a not of a younger person. And then, and that is sort of set up, as you say, I mean, because then you've got an institutionalized, I mean, you've got a role, a person who's in a particular role there, and the diviner for that occasion.
Yes. That same diviner also has a private practice.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously he's got his private practice, all right.
Yeah.
But then there must be other occasions, again, my own personal background, in which it's something which is concerned with the lineage and so on, and which you go to somebody else in that lineage.
You might go, yes.
But aren't there other situations in which you would deliberately go, or even be sent, to somebody at distance in order to find out the truth, not in the local area?
Sure. Yeah.
But, I mean, I'm thinking of the Great Ashanti expeditions up to the people outside their own community.
Yes.
Up to where Pollock worked, up in the hills there.
Yes. Well, they came outside. Up to Tonga, it came up to
and
me.
They came up to Tonga. I mean, chaps came up there, right outside their own community, and were saying that we want to go there, it's outside our politics. We want to get the real truth, even though they've got different modes of getting at it. What we really need is the truth.
Yes. Well, the answers to that is twofold. Number one, for instance, the diviner you saw dressed up in that multicolored robe, which is part of the obligations imposed on him by his divining ancestors. Whenever you go to divine, you must wear that kind of robe, you see. Now, and it's part of his obligations. Robe and cap he must wear, you see. And I mean, one knows, I know, seeing him dressed up like that, I know that his divining ancestor is a chief, or a chief's a woman, anyhow, probably a chief. That's matrilaterally related chief, because that's the way chiefs dressed, Namo dressed. See, he was a Namo from perhaps Bongo or somewhere like that, you see. So, of course, there are many occasions when you go to a diviner, or you seek out a diviner, or you summon a diviner from even a neighboring language area, and they all speak all the languages, to make absolutely certain that you haven't got anyone who knows too much about your affairs. On the other hand, you see one big difference between when the Ashanti come up, go out, and the Talensi, a very striking difference, is that if anything goes wrong with an Ashanti, the first thing he jumps to is once he suspects a matrilineal witch. Straight away, first thing that comes to his mind is a matrilineal witch. Or anyhow, somebody has either bewitched or sorcerized him. And he can't trust anybody in his own environment. That's why he goes far away. And the further away, the better. And he even doesn't trust the techniques that exist in his environment. But the Talensi aren't like that. But they do go for very important, when it's a very important occurrence. For instance, the kind of occurrence I saw was when the chiefship was vacant. See, and the local chaps were all competing, and they thought they wouldn't go to a local diviner to find out, because practically every local diviner you had some sort of stake in getting it. These are the chaps who went across to 10, 15 miles away to people like that, the neighboring language area, to do their divinations. Now, that's a very important thing when there's a tacit acknowledgement that your own diviners do know rather too much about you.
Meyer, I think I ought to thank you very much and bring it to a close, since we've gone on at least over half an hour past our usual bedtime. And anyhow, I've got another seminar coming up shortly, and I better go and do something there. Thank you very much indeed for coming along.
That's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Stephen, for arranging it, and the unit for organising it all. Yes. Thank you very much indeed.
Good.